Hi, welcome to this week's episode of The Pulse, Regen Strategic's Policy and Politics podcast. We're delighted, both Libby, Lyons and myself, to be joined today by Kylie Turner, who is the Systems Lead of Sustainable Economies at Climateworks. Kylie, welcome. And just as importantly as being on our podcast, today also happens to be your birthday. So what a treat for us and our listeners, and very generous of you.
Happy birthday, Kylie.
Thank you, Libby. What a treat for me.
Thank you. You're very kind. Take our listeners through what Climateworks does and the work that you undertake.
So at Climateworks, we like to say that we bridge the gap between research and action. And so what that means in practice is we undertake projects that provide the evidence for action to be taken in the broader policy environment, and then share that evidence both into the public domain and with policymakers. And we work across different systems, so industry, the built environment, food, land and oceans, and I lead our Sustainable Economies team.
Yeah.
So in that role, my job is to look for the things that we can change across the broader economy in order to facilitate and accelerate decarbonisation. So we work on projects like an Australian climate policy dialogue with subnational policymakers, where we explore different sectors and what they can do to accelerate action. So our most recent one was on road user charging. After Productivity Palooza decided that road user charging was something that the Australian government and Australian subnational governments should take a look at.
And this was for EVs in particular.
Yeah, I mean, road user charging, you could argue, would be across the board. But in the first instance, it is because EVs don't currently pay the fuel excise, which each of us pay when we go to the petrol pump. And so if you're not paying because you don't have a petrol vehicle or an internal combustion engine, then how might you address what will become in the future a gap in that funding?
In the time you've been in that role, what have you observed as being some of the more macro changes? What surprised you?
Oh, surprises. I think sometimes it takes a really long time for something to take an effect. So a change that you might make in the economy seems very logical, and then it takes a long time for you to see the benefits. So, for example, we're just starting to see the benefits of the safeguard mechanism in terms of emission reduction for industry. The vehicle fuel efficiency standard is a big change from an economic perspective, but we won't actually see that play through in the economy for a little while yet in terms of emissions reduction.
It's been a big week. Over the past week, at time of recording, we've had the National Climate Risk Assessment put out, and then relatively quickly, in a couple of days, the confirmation of a 2035 emissions reduction target by the government. How did you communicate to your audiences and stakeholders what those two, both individually and then in composite, contained?
So it's a big week in climate, but also a big kind of month on the back of Productivity Palooza in the kind of month before. But the way that we've been communicating it is we've known a lot of these plans were going to come out for quite some time, and some parts of them have been quite well consulted by the government. Certainly there's been a lot of consultation on the headline emissions reduction target, which has been good. The Climate Change Authority published some advice going on 15 months ago, which a lot of us have been looking at and contemplating ever since. But last week it was definitely target palooza and policy palooza time. It was useful, I think, to separate out the climate risk assessment and the climate plan, the adaptation plan, and have them earlier in the week to really create the idea of why we might be doing something. It's the second time we've really painted the picture of what climate risk looks like. And this one is definitely a deep, granular look at that. And then with the sector plans, the net zero plan and the target, and in addition, most importantly, the Treasury modelling, really important to see that out in market so that everyone can make decisions for themselves about what they are thinking about when they look at each of those scenarios. Our job has just been to try to help everyone drink from the fire hose of information. I think altogether it's something like 1,500 pages across all of the documents. That's a lot to get across. And we joked earlier that Control F is getting a heavy workout
always
across government, in industry and in the climate movement, particularly at the moment.
Kylie, can I ask a question? When I was talking to my friends that I was coming in here today, the one question that they asked me to ask you was to explain in terms that they can understand, and I tried and was far from eloquent, I can assure you, as to what net zero really means.
It is actually such a good question because there's a lot of assumed knowledge in this space and there's a lot of complexity too. But broadly, net zero is if we want to get to a zero emissions future, so based on 2005 levels, we have targets that say where we want to reduce emissions from. And then you can't do all of that just simply by reducing emissions. So there are some places where you have to take other measures. So you might use offsets or you might use carbon capture and storage. So in the hierarchy, the first thing that we try to do is reduce emissions, but then there are other measures that we will need to take across the economy in order to get to that net zero number. Net zero is an interesting and challenged notion now because you will hear a lot of conversations about real zero. So real zero is something we should always try to get to and may be possible. We don't know what technologies we might develop in order to help us reduce emissions to what we would call real zero. So it's always something we should aim for. But net zero is where there are other ways, not just of reducing emissions, but of taking more positive actions to bridge the gap.
Thank you. I will now, with other friends, try and be a little less ineloquent when I explain it, because I think it's a term that's bandied about so often, and explaining it like that yes, of course it's about reducing emissions, but it's about doing those other things until, because we can't get to real zero now. So it's looking at carbon capture and storage and those sorts of things as well. So, yeah.
Well, any new listeners to the podcast will be welcome as well, so you can point them in their direction.
I will, Pat, of course.
There was some emphasis the government put on future technological enhancements, improvements, innovation. As a business, Regen Strategic increasingly finds itself at that intersection of new entrants into that market in clean energy or some form of decarbonisation technology, or existing operators looking to go down a similar pathway. Do you think that faith in the future innovation that Australia can foster is warranted? I'm assuming Climateworks is coming across a range of very real right now improvements, but also some ones that are a bit more speculative into the future.
Yeah, we're definitely coming across more speculation. And the other thing I'd say is I increasingly notice, particularly in the industry and resources sector, a number of extra players, if you like, so a diversification of the technologies that you might rely on. Mm-hmm. I think what's really important about the technological debate is the thing that we should do is we should scale up and roll out the technologies that we know work, that are already commercial, that are already proven, but they don't get us to real zero or net zero. And so there are things that you need to do to make sure that you are actually getting to the technologies that we will need that will bridge the gap. So we don't have clear, definitive, scalable solutions for a number of our heavy industry sectors. So aluminium is really challenging, steelmaking is really challenging, and so there are a real kind of emphasis then on making sure that you develop those technologies and make sure that they are able to get to a commercial readiness level. But then on the other side of that, there are new technologies that we don't even know that we will need that might be more efficient. So those more nascent technologies, we also need to take a look at and understand if they're going to be the sorts of technologies that will be at the commercial readiness level and able to be scaled in the future. And some of them will have a niche but important role, and some of them will have a much bigger role across the economy as well.
Yeah.
And do you feel that the industries such as the steelmaking industry and the aluminium industry are doing their best? We hear that certainly their PR tells us that they're doing, their best. But do you really feel that those sorts of industries are doing all that they can?
I think it's challenging to say they're doing all that they can because it's hard to look on the inside and see what's really happening. And a lot of them are, they've been doing the same thing in the same way for a really long time. And there's a change management and a culture management piece in that needs to shift. It's not easy to make big transformational change overnight, and some of them will need to do that on a technology basis. I do think they really mean to. They definitely understand the scale of the challenge. They understand how hard it will be to get finance in the future, how much value there might be in being a first-of-a-kind mover on a green product. There's a lot of economic opportunity up for grabs, and I think they definitely see that. And reporting too means that because they have to report on emissions and they have to report what their plans look like for a decarbonised future, there's much more incentive inside the ecosystem, if you like, to actually help them do the things that they need to do and do it in really good faith.
Having said all of that, how do you pass if we go back a month, how do you pass the approval for Woodside and Northwest Shelf in amongst everything that we've just talked about with climate risk assessment, emissions reduction targets? The sequencing of all of that has been quite fascinating to observe.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, particularly interesting for Western Australians, as you know. So, Woodside are based here. There's a lot of understanding of what LNG particularly has brought to this state and to the national economy more particularly. But it is very hard to balance. That's a lot of what we would call Scope 3 emissions, but it's also a lot of onshore emissions. So Scope 3 is when, you've sold that and it emits into the broader global economy, if you like. And that's particularly the case for LNG. But there are also a lot of emissions expended inside of Australia on actually producing the LNG and getting it ready, processing it, if you like, for export overseas. I think we just need to keep having a really grown-up conversation about that and to understand what it looks like. We definitely hear the idea that exporting into Southeast Asian nations is the only way that they'll be able to decarbonise.
I was just about to go there, yeah.
Yeah, I think what we would say about that is, let's see the plan for what that looks like and be very transparent, We know that not all gas fields are the same in terms of their carbon emissions. So which ones are the ones that are better from an emissions perspective and prioritise which ones you don't need. Yeah. The reality is that we aren't going to need a lot of LNG in the global economy out to 2050. Our modelling in the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative showed a 67% production decline. What it means, though, is that there is some in 2050.
Yes. Yeah.
And there will be a lot of players who are trying to compete for that slice of gas export. We need to take a really good, long, hard look about whether we think that will be in Western Australia or in Australia, or whether other nation states might underwrite their companies or their kind of in their nation state, the companies that operate there, their activities. And that's a question. That's where we have to have a plan for what's happening across the global economy, but also understand our role in that from an Australian perspective.
And you talked before, Kylie, about technological advancement, the capital investment that would be required to seize on that opportunity. I guess there's a national conversation that needs to be had about where that capital is best placed in a scenario out to 2050 where you have a 67% projected decline in LNG exports, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So is that the most appropriate, efficient, ethical use of that capital?
So I like to think about this in a kind of same, but slightly different way. So if you're operating a corporation and you are undertaking an activity that, won't be needed or won't be needed to the same extent in the future, you make a decision as a business about whether you will wither on the vine or you will diversify. And I actually think Western Australia has to make that choice as well. So what are the things that we can do that will have a real economic opportunity for all Western Australians into the future? And what are the things that we need to accept will just, have a staged and very deliberate decline, but will decline and not be a part of that system? And you would, on current settings, you would balance LNG exports with the potential for green iron exports in Western Australia, for example. And that's a conversation we should have, particularly given some very good announcements last week about potentials for green iron projects here in WA.
Yeah. It's not a sitting week. We tend to cover, when it is a sitting week, a few of the ebbs and flows through WA Parliament in particular. There is, however, a committee that's looking into decarbonisation pathways for the state, with a noted inclusion in that terms of reference to interrogate effectively the validity of that claim around assisting major trading partners to decarbonise and the role in particular of LNG to do that. Is that something that Climateworks provides submissions to? Do you support that work going forward?
Well, I wholeheartedly support the democratic process. And committees are such a good way to really get under the hood and understand better and also develop a bit of shared knowledge and experience inside the parliament, because being a parliamentarian is not easy. You've got to be across a lot of things. You're making decisions that are material to people. We will likely make a submission, and we have definitely been encouraging others, particularly across the national picture, to make submissions. I do think it is very, very useful to be taking a look at what it actually means when we make the claim about decarbonising Southeast Asia. Because it might well be that if we look at it and the evidence says that that's accurate, that's great, and we should work out the plan for how that happens. But it would also be useful to know if that claim is able to be backed up and, that it meets the volume that we're talking about extracting and exporting on current settings. Yeah,
and look, whether it's behind closed doors committee hearings or public submissions, it's going to be a very useful and timely trove of information going forward for the state.
There is a group I think it would be really interesting to hear from, and it is those nation states that might underwrite corporations inside of their borders in terms of support. Like, I do think that's a conversation that is worth having. It's obviously not one that is going to be duked out in the public domain, but how interesting would it be to hear from oil-rich states where they're already compromised and need to diversify, and gas is something that they really want to support, like how much they might support that versus how much we as a middle power can support the LNG exports that we currently have and have planned to have out into the future.
For a listed entity, but not a NOC or a national oil company.
Yeah, because they're very different propositions,
They
right?
Certainly are.
Like, the difference between a corporation and an ADNOC is like huge.
Yeah. How much wiggle room did Chris Bowen and vis-a-vis the Australian government have on accepting the Climate Change Authority's recommendations? That seems to be the commonly reported fact, that the Climate Change Authority made a set of recommendations, gave a range, that's been endorsed by the government. What would have gone into a consideration of endorsing those recommendations, or how would the validity of those recommendations be asserted?
I think you can see like what's gone into them with like the rest of what sits around it. So the Treasury modelling is material, right? That is validating of the advice that the Climate Change Authority has given. The Climate Change Authority has undertaken some pretty heavily consultative processes. So they did publish a range for consideration of 65 to 75% in 2024. And there was a lot of, and you can see it reflected in their current report, there was a lot of submissions to that process. I think it's more of a question of the 62 to 70% range is big. That is a much broader range than anyone really was expecting. I think that's more the wriggle room. And if you listen very carefully to what Matt Keane says in subsequent podcasts that he's done, but also in the actual announcement, is that he views that 62 to 70% gives the Australian economy the ability to overachieve, and that's really important too. As a person who would really like to see climate action, so my kids can live on this planet and have kids who live on this planet, like I'll take the 70% number as a floor, and we'll be encouraging everyone to try to overachieve on that. But the 62% and the broader kind of 8% range is really acknowledging of how challenging it is. This is not easy, right? Like we've already reduced emissions. We need to double what we're doing before 2030, and we almost need to double that again by 2035. That's a huge effort. And the most important thing is that the effort is not on the 31st of December 2034. It is now, and this 5 years will set us up for the second 5 years of that decade, and that's the other really important bit to remember. So the minister might think he has wriggle room, but I also think he's very cognizant of what the scale of the task is.
Yeah. Oh, look, the minister's sincere, if nothing else. So I'm sure he's thinking through implementation and the next steps beyond the next steps as we speak.
Well, the implementation is in the sector plans that they've also published.
Yeah.
And that is if there's like one thing that's really, really good out of the Target Palooza from last week, I mean, we're all very focused on the number and it was always going to be that way. But the most important thing that we've done is we've set out the implementation plans. That's not just from an Australian perspective, that's required by the UNFCCC. Yeah. And is already submitted and on their website, which is very heartening. So we are required to say what our long-term implementation plan is. And for the first time, we really have that. And it's a really valuable line in the sand from an investment perspective, from an activity perspective, from what we will do with particular policies. We've really begun to create the ecosystem that will be the foundation that we can really achieve from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I feel the conversation has changed quite markedly in, like, thinking back 15 years ago, the height of the climate wars in Canberra. I mean, I know that's had a long tail, but I feel like the conversation's matured. It's become more sophisticated. Parts of it are being implemented.
I think it's changed in the last 5 years. I think it's changed dramatically in 15, but I think it's changed in the last 5.
Yeah.
I really do. I think there's a broader community acceptance, and because I think that was probably lacking a little 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But whereas I think now there's just this broad acceptance now that this just has to happen.
There's also a lot of economic opportunity to be realised.
Immense.
And if Australians are good at one thing, it's being able to see what the direction of travel is in order to retain this very lovely lifestyle we have. It's not an option for us to choose to wither on the vine, if you like. I also think I'd be so curious to know why you think it's changed in the last 5 years, because one of the things we really notice is that small-scale renewable systems on people's houses, where they realise benefits in terms of reducing bills, makes a huge difference to the perception of climate action generally, because if you can imagine it on your house, you can imagine it at a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
But it might also be that people are seeing the effects of climate change.
I think from my perspective, and I'm that little bit older than you, it's that I hear my friends and my friends' children are just talking about it as it's never been spoken about before. It's part of it's just an accepted part of conversation around a dinner table or when you go out for a coffee. I think and that's why I talk about that broader acceptance. I think that, yes, there are far more people wanting batteries for their homes, solar panels, you name it. And I think that has a big impact in that sort of daily conversation. And so from my perspective, it's that people actually talk about it now. 5 years ago, there was, more... it was talked about, but not as openly. And so I think that people now really see that there's a need for action, and they're also asking themselves, well, what, as well as my solar panels, what else can I do? And I think that's the marked change. What else can I do as a household, as an individual, as a car driver, what can I do?
Yeah. There seems to be a bit of a gap as well, where there's a lot of emphasis on individual action and then large corporate, national, subnational, national action. But that bit about the community, your neighbourhood, your suburb, your postcode, it seems to have missed out a little bit. I just wonder whether there's an opportunity to talk more broadly about opportunities for community batteries or some of the charging initiatives that have been trialled but maybe not taken up at scale by various municipalities. Is that something that's registering with what you're seeing and sensing?
Not from our work's perspective necessarily, but that could just be a function of, the space in which I most often have conversations. Yeah. But I would observe that local government authorities have really led the way in a lot of places where state governments or federal governments might have been laggard at particular points. They are responsible for putting in charging stations, for working out whether community batteries will have a place. But there's probably more that they can do. I think they're also looking at it from a cost reduction basis. And when that changes, you might start to see that community piece flow through. Yeah. There are also a number of programs across Australia that are about electrifying postcodes, and that's a really interesting proposition. Because that stands to do something, if you were to do thermal upgrades of homes so that they were more comfortable and more efficient generally, and you had a solar panel and batteries and...
double glazing.
Yeah, double glazing, and you had an EV to plug it into, you do a couple of things. You save yourself money at the household level. You also save the system a lot of money. But if you concentrate that into a postcode and you do it there, you also build up the ecosystem of supply. So the tradies that you need to install them, the knowledge that they need. I mean, how many of us have wanted to get something new from an energy efficiency perspective? At our house it was a heat pump and the tradie had to be persuaded to get the heat pump, or an induction cooktop was the other one. I had to be very persuasive about wanting an induction cooktop. That's a reality, but if you build that up around a postcode and then you ripple that out, that's a really good way to get things going.
Yeah, and you're quite right, because I remember probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, my husband wanted to heat the pool and he wanted a heat pump, but he couldn't talk anyone into it, and there wasn't really the technology here in Perth, and he just couldn't believe that we couldn't get a heat pump. And so I think... whereas now, things have changed a lot. And again, I think they're the sorts of reasons why I point to the fact that I think in the last 5 years we're seeing a big change, a far bigger leap than we did from 15 years ago, I think.
Yeah, agreed. We're about at time, but I thought I'd give you the opportunity, Kylie, to give a plug on your birthday, just because it's your birthday, to... another podcast in the spirit of podcast collegiality. So tell us about This Is Too Much.
So This Is Too Much is actually a spin-off of what is my favourite podcast, other than this one, of course. Which I'm
and
clearly
this
in love
episode particular.
with. This episode's great. But Let Me Sum Up is a podcast that is co-hosted by some friends of mine, Luke Menzel, who's the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, Francesca Muscovic, who's just gone to work at the Investor Group on climate change, and Tennant Reid, who I like to call Australia's favourite climate policy wonk, but he also works at Australian Industry Group. And they started this pod years ago, 3 years ago, I think, and they decided that there were a lot of reports in the ecosystem. This is true. If nothing was more true last week, it's definitely true. And that they would collectively use their experience and their friendship to sum them up for the broader climate community. And it is a really, really educational experience. It's great if you work in the space. There are a bunch of reports I don't have to read.
Yeah. No more Control F.
Yeah, that's right. And Let Me Sum Up is a riff off The Princess Bride, of course.
Yeah.
And in the same line that is given, there is this is too much, so let me sum up. So This Is Too Much is the behind the paywall edition.
There you go.
Of the Let Me Sum Up bigger.
It's the deep cut.
Yeah, but it's definitely worth a listen.
Yeah, very good. Well,
Great.
on both
Thank
of those, feel free to like and subscribe, I guess.
Definitely subscribe to the Patreon. You will make Frankie very happy.
Very good. We're always looking out for Frankie. Thank you once again for sharing your birthday. We much appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie.
Thanks for joining us today, Kylie. And to all our listeners and viewers, feel free to like and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to this on. Really important that we stay engaged. Happy to hear from you, so drop us a comment as well. Thank you.